Welcome to Didactic. Today is Tuesday, March 25th, 2025. I am your host, Dr. O'Leary, a child and adolescent psychiatry fellow in the National Capital Region. This is a podcast I designed to help myself and others study for their boards, learn a little bit about psychiatry, or just nerd out. I am using AI to assist me with the content creation. The tool that I use to create this episode allows me to feed in papers that I got from a literature search on a topic, including peer-reviewed and what I consider to be reputable sources, and then it can produce a podcast. I have to create a prompt to guide the discussion, and usually I have to create 2 or 3 different prompts and explore the output of each, then pick the best parts, edit out the problem parts, and paste it all together. You could say I am a curator of the content. And even though I'm using AI, all the content in this podcast should be considered my opinion and no one else's. At the very least, it's compiled by me and released to you, so I take responsibility for that. If you find errors or you have suggestions for improvement, I would love it if you could go to psydactic.com and fill out a form there, or you can just email me at feedback@psydactic.com. It's PSYDACTIC.com. I'm going to release this episode in both my Psydactic and Psydactic Child and Adolescent Psychiatry edition because the topic has so much overlap with adult psychiatry and reflects a global crisis. Today I discuss gambling disorder, and as your AI host will point out later, the rate of this disorder among adolescents is skyrocketed with the advent of online and mobile gambling platforms and the loosening of restrictions on sports betting in the United States. Let me start with the DSM-5 criteria for gambling disorder. So the DSM-5 defines gambling disorder as a persistent and recurrent problematic gambling behavior leading to clinically significant impairment or distress, and it's indicated by an individual exhibiting 4 or more of the following 9 items in a 12-month period. 1. Needs to gamble with increased amounts of money in order to achieve the desired excitement. 2. Is restless or irritable when attempting to cut down or stop gambling. 3. Has made repeated unsuccessful efforts to control, cut back, or stop gambling. 4. Is often preoccupied with gambling. 5. Often gambles when feeling distressed. 6. After losing money gambling, often returns another day to get even. Is chasing one's losses. 7. Lies to conceal the extent of involvement with gambling. 8. Has jeopardized or lost a significant relationship, job, or educational or career opportunity because of gambling. 9. Relies on others to provide money to relieve desperate financial situations caused by gambling. Basically a financial bailout. Now, a lot of people who are experiencing a manic episode may gamble and lose lots of money, but if this occurs within the mania and is not a problem outside of the manic episode, this would not be gambling disorder. Now, the DSM-5 compared to the DSM-4 has a few changes. First, the DSM-4 included a criterion about committing illegal acts like forgery, fraud, or theft to finance the gambling. But it was removed in the DSM-5 because it was found to be relatively rare and almost always occurring in conjunction with other criteria. And speaking of that criteria, I remember when I was younger driving to Kansas City with a friend of mine so that we could bail his father out of jail. His father was in jail for stealing a purse at a casino because he had run out of money. But this was also comorbid with a pretty severe drinking problem. I wonder why casinos serve alcohol. Another thing that's different between the DSM-4 and the DSM-5 is a reduction in the diagnostic threshold. So instead of needing at least 5 out of 10 criteria for a diagnosis of gambling disorder, DSM-5 reduced the threshold to 4 of 9. It also reflects a general trend in the DSM-5 to conceptualize gambling disorder as a behavioral addiction with significant overlap with substance use disorders, and instead of as an impulse control disorder, as people used to conceptualize it. Now, there's something also called problem gambling, and this is a more loosely defined term and not something I'm going to spend a lot of time on today. But in general, you could consider problem gambling as gambling that doesn't quite meet 4 out of those 9 criteria, but there is still significant impact on the person's life. It's kind of like nascent gambling disorder. In any case, now I'm going to turn you over to my AI co-hosts, Aiko and Ainsley, or you could call them Eamon and Aylin, or you can call them whatever you want. They don't care. They're just the products of algorithms.
Welcome back, everyone, to The Deep Dive. Today, we are going to get into something that a lot of people have a relationship with in one way or another.
Yep.
Gambling. For some, it's a bit of fun, maybe a way to spice up a game or, a quick lottery ticket here and there.
Sure.
But for others, it can be a real struggle, and we're not here to judge anyone, but to really try to get a better understanding of what's going on inside the brain.
Right. So for this deep dive, we have pulled together as much research as possible. So that would be things like those really dense scientific articles with all the statistics and methodology.
Oh, yeah.
And also some systematic reviews. So those take a look at a bunch of articles and give us a kind of zoomed out picture.
Nice.
And then also meta-analyses.
Okay.
And we've also taken a look at what some experts are saying on platforms like YouTube, just to get a really well-rounded view.
Cool. So today's mission is to unpack why gambling can be so engaging. And for some, why it can be so hard to control. And we're going to really try to go beyond willpower.
Right.
And understand what's actually happening in the brain. So things like the reward system, the neurochemicals involved, and even how the actual design of these gambling activities can kind of really mess with our brains.
Yeah.
So by the end of this, we want to give you a more complete picture of how it all actually works. The biological underpinnings of why people get into trouble with gambling. So let's start with the brain's reward system and dopamine, I guess.
Yeah, dopamine is this neurochemical that is involved in both pleasure and learning.
Right.
So when we do things that our brain finds rewarding, like gambling, we get this surge of dopamine, and that feels good. It gives us pleasure, it gives us excitement, and then crucially, it makes us want to repeat whatever behavior gave us that feeling.
So if I gamble and I win, that dopamine is going to make me want to keep doing it. Okay. Now, I was watching this TEDx talk by Carolyn Hawley, and she made a really interesting point. The anticipation of a win, she was saying, actually plays a big part in that dopamine release.
Right.
It's not just the win, it's like even expecting something good to happen.
Right. Yeah.
Like maybe the next hand is going to be the big one.
Yeah.
That can cause a dopamine release.
Yeah, it's like almost like your brain is priming you for more rewards.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But this is where it gets kind of tricky. She also explained that in people who develop a gambling addiction, that dopamine response isn't only happening with wins anymore.
Right. And that is that's actually a really important point because it might seem kind of counterintuitive.
Yeah.
But in some people, even losing can trigger a dopamine response. Kind of like what happens with winning. And this really explains why people chase losses, that really powerful urge to keep gambling.
Oh, yeah.
To try and win back the money they've lost, even though it seems like a bad idea.
Yeah.
Their brain is essentially telling them that, the next bet could be the one that brings back that rewarding feeling.
Okay. And she also mentioned, if I remember correctly, that those dopamine responses, so those surges, they can actually be higher, whether they are happening during wins or losses in people who have a gambling problem compared to people who are just casual gamblers.
Right. So their brain's reward system is basically becoming super sensitized to anything gambling related.
So that's scary. Okay. Let's talk about how gambling can kind of blur the lines between winning and losing, especially when it comes to near misses.
Ugh, I hate those.
Yeah.
Like when you're so close on the slot machine, you have 2 of the symbols lined up perfectly.
Right.
And that third one is just like a hair off.
Yeah, so frustrating.
You can't help but think, oh, I was so close next time. But that's the thing. It was a loss.
Right.
Objectively.
Yeah.
But the brain interprets it as being almost a win, which triggers some of the same reward pathways as an actual win.
Right.
And that just makes you want to keep playing.
It's like our brains are trying to trick us into thinking that we almost won, so we should just keep going.
Right, exactly.
Right.
And when you think about how fast some of these modern gambling games are, like online slots,
Oh, yeah.
you can rack up losses so quickly.
Right.
And those near misses just kind of sprinkle in there and keep you hooked.
Like a constant barrage of losing and almost winning.
Yeah. And Holly pointed out that because dopamine is so important in learning, all this repetition of losses with these near misses mixed in can actually make changes in the brain that make you even more susceptible to becoming addicted.
So you're training your brain in a way to chase that high.
Right.
Even when it keeps failing.
Exactly.
Okay. What about this idea of dark flow? I think Holly mentioned that as well. What is that?
Yeah, dark flow is when you get so absorbed in playing. Usually it's these really fast-paced online games that you totally lose track of time, where you are, and how much money you're spending.
Oh, wow.
And that becomes a really big problem when you're losing a lot.
Oh, yeah.
But you're just so focused on the game that you don't even realize how much damage you're doing.
So let me ask you this. As you keep gambling, even when you are losing more and more, does your brain keep reacting the same way? Or does it change over time?
Well, this is where we get into the concept of tolerance.
Okay.
Just like with drugs, people can develop a tolerance to gambling.
Really?
Yeah. So over time, they might find that they need to gamble more money, or they need to gamble more often to get that same feeling of excitement that they used to get.
So it's like they need a bigger and bigger hit to get the same rush.
Right, exactly.
That makes sense. I remember Tim Fong from the Nevada Council on Problem Gambling. He said something like, I want more to get more response, which is kind of sums it up perfectly.
Right, so this adaptation in the brain is a big part of what happens with addiction.
Okay.
So your brain gets used to a certain level of stimulation, and it needs more and more to get the same effect.
Okay.
And this developing tolerance is something that you really see with addictive behaviors, and it's usually not as prominent in people who just gamble socially,
Yeah.
for fun.
Okay. So we've talked about how the reward system gets kind of rewired, but what about stress? I mean, doesn't stress play a role in a lot of these addictive behaviors?
Definitely. Cortisol, which is like the main stress hormone, it has a huge impact on the brain.
Right.
And when someone is chronically stressed, which can be both a cause and an effect of gambling problems, it can actually change the physical structure of the brain.
Wow.
And how it functions. Dr. Fong even described it as like potentially leading to a frightened brain.
Frightened brain.
Yeah.
That's kind of an unsettling thought.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it means that the brain is kind of in a constant state of high alert.
Okay.
Maybe more sensitive to triggers.
Right.
And less able to, control impulsive behaviors.
Okay. And it's not just about cortisol either, right?
Right.
Dr. Fong was saying that this overuse of the brain's neurochemical systems, from all that gambling, can be really tough on the brain over time.
Right.
So it's like if you keep running your car engine at max RPMs, eventually it's going to burn out.
Yeah.
Exactly. Like, this is pretty complicated stuff, but it is starting to make sense. It's not just about someone being weak-willed or anything.
Yeah.
There are actual physical changes happening in the brain.
Right.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit and talk about this idea of addiction by design. I've seen that phrase in some of the research, particularly in this report from the Lancet Public Health Commission. What's that all about?
Addiction by design is basically this idea that a lot of the gambling products out there are made in a way that encourages you to keep playing, to keep engaging with them.
Right.
So the main goal, at least from the perspective of the gambling companies, is to make sure you spend as much time and money as possible on their products.
Yeah.
The Lancet report even used this phrase, play to extinction.
Wow.
Which is kind of a scary thought.
Yeah.
But it basically means they want you to keep playing until you're broke.
Wow. What kind of features are we talking about here? What are they doing to achieve that?
Well, you see it a lot in those continuous forms of gambling, like slot machines.
Okay.
Both the physical ones in casinos and the online versions.
Right.
It's that speed of play. There's always something happening. New bets, flashing lights, sounds, and the way they show you the wins and near misses.
Yeah.
Just keeps you thinking that big win is right around the corner. And the Lancet Commission also pointed out that even those less intense forms of gambling, like, lotteries and bingo,
Yeah.
they've been redesigned to be more engaging.
Really?
Yeah, they have more frequent draws.
Okay.
And now there's online versions with slot machine elements like, Slingo.
Okay.
So it's all designed to make it faster and potentially more addictive. Yeah.
Yeah, and I've also noticed with sports betting, there's been a huge increase in these personalized betting options and this whole in-play betting thing where you can bet on every little detail of the game as it's happening.
Oh, yeah.
It's like nonstop.
It's really dynamic.
Yeah.
And it keeps you really engaged. But like the Lancet report said, that's kind of the point, right? The bookmakers want to keep you hooked.
Yeah. And speaking of being hooked, we can't ignore the sheer amount of gambling advertising that's everywhere.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's on TV, it's online, it's on our phones. What does the research say about the impact of all that advertising?
Well, based on what we found, including this really good review by McGrain and her colleagues, which was published in Public Health, there's a clear link between seeing gambling ads and having more positive attitudes towards gambling.
Okay.
And also people report that they're more likely to gamble.
So the more we see these ads, the more we want to gamble.
Basically, yeah. And not only that, they found something called a dose-response effect.
Okay. What's that?
So it means that the more you're exposed to gambling advertising,
Okay.
the more likely you are to gamble more frequently
Right.
and engage in riskier gambling behavior. And this is especially true for people who are already at risk of having gambling problems.
That's concerning. So it's like these ads are almost targeting the people who are most vulnerable.
Yeah.
What about kids? I know there's been a lot of talk about how these ads are affecting young people.
Yeah, that's a big concern.
Yeah.
Kids and teenagers are seeing these ads all the time,
Right.
and they're very aware of them. And the problem is that both parents and kids often see these ads as making gambling seem normal.
Oh, yeah.
Like it's just a harmless, everyday activity.
Right.
And that can be really dangerous because it can shape how young people view gambling.
Yeah, it's like those old cigarette ads that tried to make smoking seem cool and normal.
Right, exactly.
And I know the Lancet Commission mentioned that gambling companies are using some of those same tactics now, like with social media influencers.
Yeah, they're using social media and these online personalities
Okay.
to reach people, especially younger audiences
Right.
who are, more influenced by what they see online.
It's scary how good they are at marketing. Okay.
Yeah.
So we've got this reward system in our brain that can get hijacked. The games are designed to keep us playing. And we're surrounded by advertising that makes it all seem okay.
Right.
But what about these cognitive distortions? I've heard that term before.
Yeah.
What exactly are those?
So this is where the psychology of gambling comes in. It's not just about changes in the brain. It's also about these unhealthy thinking patterns
Okay.
that people develop that keep them stuck in that cycle of gambling.
Can you give me some examples? What kinds of things are we talking about?
Yeah, so one example is something called attributional bias.
Okay.
And that's where people overestimate their skills
Okay.
and underestimate the role of luck when it comes to gambling.
So they think they're winning because they're good at it,
Right.
not just because they got lucky.
Exactly.
Okay.
Another one is the gambler's fallacy.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that one.
Yeah, that's the belief that, if something hasn't happened for a while, it's bound to happen soon.
Right. So if you've been losing a lot, you start thinking, okay, this next one has to be a win.
Right. And so they keep gambling, trying to recoup those losses
Right.
based on this faulty logic.
It seems so logical when you say it out loud,
Yeah.
but I guess in the moment it can be pretty convincing.
Yeah, absolutely.
What other kinds of cognitive distortions are there?
Well, there's a lot, actually. Like, people might have inaccurate beliefs about randomness. So they might think they can somehow influence a random event,
Right.
like, blowing on the dice or something.
Yeah.
And there are also superstitious beliefs,
Oh, yeah.
like having a lucky charm or a ritual that they think will help them win.
Right. Right.
And then there's also selective memory,
Okay.
where they remember their wins really clearly,
Right.
but they kind of forget about all the times they lost.
Yeah.
And there's also something called the illusion of control,
Oh, okay.
where they feel like they have more control over the outcome of the game than they actually do.
Okay, so they think they can somehow outsmart the system.
Right. And then there's also what we call illusory associations,
Okay.
where people see patterns that aren't really there.
Okay.
And they use those patterns to try and predict what's going to happen next.
So it's like our brains are trying to find order in chaos,
Right.
which with gambling is kind of impossible.
Yeah, exactly.
And those wins, even if they're not that frequent, they must really reinforce those distorted beliefs.
They do, because that's what we call intermittent reinforcement.
Okay.
So the wins come on this unpredictable schedule,
Right.
which keeps your brain engaged, keeps it seeking that reward.
Okay.
And then there's also negative reinforcement,
Okay.
which is when gambling provides like a temporary escape from negative emotions,
Okay.
like stress or anxiety.
Right.
So it becomes a coping mechanism, even though it's not a healthy one.
Right. Right. Okay, so all of this really paints a pretty comprehensive picture of how gambling can become such a huge problem for some people. Now, are there certain people who are more likely to develop these issues?
Yeah, there are definitely some risk factors that have been identified.
Okay, like what?
Well, being younger is a risk factor.
Okay.
And also being male. Also, socioeconomic factors play a role. So things like, growing up in a disadvantaged neighborhood or having a lower socioeconomic status, those can increase your risk.
Okay. Now, I'm curious about the COVID-19 pandemic. Did that have any noticeable effect on gambling behavior?
It did. A meta-analysis that was published in Current Addiction Reports, it looked at a lot of studies and found that behavioral addictions overall,
Okay.
including gambling addiction, seemed to be a pretty significant problem during the pandemic. Their estimate was that the rate of gambling addiction during that time was around 7.2%.
Wow, that's pretty high. Do we know why there was that increase during the pandemic?
Well, the study found a link between how much internet access a country had and the prevalence of gambling addiction.
Okay, that makes sense. Everyone was stuck at home,
Right.
online more.
Exactly.
So it's kind of natural that online gambling would go up.
Yeah. And they also found that people who didn't gamble online before COVID but started during lockdown, they actually tended to have more severe gambling problems
Oh, wow.
and lower incomes compared to people who were already gambling online before the pandemic.
It's like those lockdowns kind of push some people towards online gambling.
Right, as a way to cope or for entertainment.
Yeah.
But for some, it didn't end well.
Right. Okay, let's talk a bit about sports betting specifically.
Okay.
Because that has become really popular in recent years. What does the research tell us about sports betting?
Well, a recent review published in the Journal of Gambling Studies looked at a bunch of research on sports betting and found that men who are more impulsive tend to be more drawn to sports betting.
That makes sense. It's fast-paced. There's always something happening. You can get quick results.
Yeah, it's all about that instant gratification.
Right.
And the thrill of potentially winning quickly.
Okay, what about mental health issues? Is there a connection between sports betting and other mental health problems?
Yeah, actually, research shows that sports betting often occurs alongside other mental health conditions,
Okay.
especially substance use disorders.
Right.
And other types of addiction.
Okay.
So it suggests that there might be some shared vulnerabilities in the brain that make people more susceptible to both gambling and other addictive behaviors.
Interesting.
And there's also been research on daily fantasy sports, or DFS,
Okay.
which has found that playing DFS regularly is a strong predictor of gambling problems,
Really?
especially in college students.
That's surprising. I think a lot of people see DFS as more of a game of skill than traditional gambling.
Yeah, there is definitely a skill component to DFS.
Right.
But the chance element and the potential to win money
Right.
can still trigger those same reward circuits in the brain,
Okay.
especially in people who might already be vulnerable to gambling problems.
So it's not just about luck versus skill. It's about how your brain reacts to the whole experience.
Right, exactly.
Okay, wow. This has been a really fascinating look at the neurobiology of gambling. It's amazing how many different factors are involved. The brain's reward system, dopamine, the way these games are designed, all that advertising, and even our own thinking patterns.
Yeah, it's really complex.
So just to recap some key takeaways,
Okay.
gambling really activates those specific pathways in the brain, especially the dopamine reward system.
Right.
And as we've discussed, it's not just winning that triggers that response.
Yeah.
Even the anticipation of winning and even losing, especially for people with gambling problems,
Right.
can release dopamine. And the way those gambling products are designed and all that advertising, it just makes it harder to resist.
Yeah.
And we can't forget about those cognitive distortions, those faulty thinking patterns that kind of keep people trapped.
Right.
But it's important to remember that all this brain stuff is just one part of the story.
Yeah.
Social factors,
Right.
economic factors, psychological factors,
Right.
all of those play a role too.
So if someone's gambling is becoming a problem, how do clinicians actually figure that out? It seems like it's something people might try to hide.
Yeah. Gambling disorder can be really sneaky. It's often hidden. And it's estimated that less than 15% of people who actually have the disorder ever get treatment. That just shows you how important screening is. It needs to be a standard part of healthcare because right now, it's not something that's routinely checked during regular checkups.
So what are the tools clinicians use to screen for gambling disorder? Are there specific questionnaires or something?
There are a few. There's the SCIPG, the South Oaks Gambling Screen, or SOGS, the Diagnostic Interview for Gambling Severity, DIGS. Even the 20 questions used by Gamblers Anonymous, those can be helpful for screening. And then there are shorter ones, like the Massachusetts Gambling Screen and the Gambling Assessment Module. One that I find particularly useful is the Libet questionnaire. It's just 2 questions, but they're really powerful. Have you ever felt the need to lie to people you care about how much you gambled? And have you ever felt the need to bet more and more money to get the same feeling? It's simple, but it's very effective at identifying potential problems.
The Libet questionnaire, that's pretty straightforward. Why isn't something like that used more often?
It's a good question. Honestly, sometimes it's just a lack of awareness. A lot of healthcare providers don't realize how common and how serious gambling disorder is. They may also feel pressed for time. And then there's the stigma. Addiction in general carries a lot of stigma, and gambling disorder is no different. We even came across a case where a patient was really upset because a diagnosis of gaming disorder was put in their medical record. It shows you how sensitive people can be about these labels, and it really highlights how important it is to communicate clearly and compassionately.
Yeah, it makes sense. So let's say someone is diagnosed with gambling disorder. What kinds of treatments actually work?
Well, cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, that's really the gold standard for treating gambling disorder. The idea behind it is that the disorder stems from, messed up learning processes and distorted thinking patterns. Things like the illusion of control, where someone thinks they can control random events, or the gambler's fallacy, where they think past events will affect future ones, like if they've lost a few times, they believe a win is due.
So CBT helps them change those thoughts and behaviors.
Exactly. CBT helps people recognize those distorted beliefs and the harmful behaviors that come with them, and it helps them challenge those thoughts. Studies show that CBT can help people gamble less often and reduce the amount of money they're wagering. And there are even benefits that have been seen months and even years after treatment. And when you combine CBT with support groups like Gamblers Anonymous, the results are even better. People are more likely to stay away from gambling altogether after 12 months.
I noticed some debate in the research about how long those therapy sessions should last to be most effective.
Yeah, there's some back and forth about that. Some studies say short-term CBT is enough. Others say you need longer-term therapy to really make those changes stick and prevent relapse. It's something to keep in mind. And another important point is that therapy like CBT can help with other mental health issues too. A lot of people with gambling disorder also have depression or anxiety, and CBT can help with those symptoms as well.
What about medication? Does that have a role in treating gambling disorder?
So right now, there's no FDA-approved medication specifically for gambling disorder. However, medication can be really helpful for treating other conditions that often go along with it, like ADHD, depression, or bipolar disorder. These conditions can sometimes make gambling behaviors worse, and some medications show promise in reducing cravings and the urge to gamble. It's not a magic bullet, but it can be part of a comprehensive treatment plan. And we can't forget about sleep. Getting enough sleep is crucial for the brain to heal and for people to be able to focus on their recovery.
So it's not just about therapy medication, it's about a whole lifestyle change. Are there other things that are important for a good treatment plan?
Absolutely. Motivational interviewing is a really helpful technique. It helps people explore their feelings about change, work through that back and forth of wanting to change but also being hesitant. And family therapy can be huge. Gambling disorder affects everyone in the family, not just the person with the disorder. And of course, self-help programs like Gamblers Anonymous and Smart Recovery offer incredible peer support and a structured approach to recovery. In the end, the most successful treatment plans often involve a combination of all these approaches. And it takes real commitment from the person with the disorder. They have to be willing to stick with it and be honest about their gambling.
This is all great information for people who are struggling. But what about parents who are worried about their teenagers? What can they do to help and maybe prevent problems from starting in the first place?
Parents have such a vital role to play here. Teaching kids about finances, working that into family life, maybe even getting the church or community groups involved can really make a difference. It's about giving teenagers the tools to manage their money responsibly, having open conversations about the risks of gambling, making sure they understand the dangers. And churches and youth organizations can provide healthy alternatives, fun activities, positive mentorships, things like that.
You mentioned a story earlier about a mother who took really decisive action when her son was struggling.
Oh, yeah. The mother who got her son into residential treatment for his gambling problem. That's a perfect example of how important it is for parents to be aware, to step in early, and to get professional help if they need it. And parents need to realize that just blocking gambling apps on their kid's phone isn't enough. Teenagers are resourceful. They'll find ways around that. What they really need is a strong support system and honest communication.
So, taking a step back, what about on a larger scale? What common sense regulations and laws could help reduce how many people are dealing with gambling disorder, especially young people?
This is where policy really comes in. Right now, we are just bombarded with gambling ads everywhere we look, all over the media. And while it's hard to prove that seeing these ads directly causes gambling disorder, there's more and more evidence that there's a link between being exposed to those ads and how people think and act about gambling. People who are already at risk, they definitely notice these ads more, and they're more likely to say that the ads made them gamble more, especially when it comes to sports betting.
And seeing all those ads, it almost makes it seem normal, like gambling is just a harmless activity, especially for kids and teenagers.
Exactly. Kids and teens see those ads and they start to think gambling is just a normal, risk-free part of life. And the way sports betting is being marketed these days, it's very similar to how tobacco companies used to market cigarettes. And that's a big red flag. It suggests that we need to take a page from how we regulate tobacco advertising.
You're talking about things like restricting where and how gambling can be advertised, maybe even running counter-advertising campaigns.
Exactly. Think back to how we dealt with tobacco ads. There was the fairness doctrine, which forced broadcasters to present both sides of controversial issues. So alongside those cigarette commercials, you'd also see anti-smoking messages. And eventually, we banned tobacco ads on TV and radio altogether. We need to consider similar strategies for gambling ads, especially on platforms where a lot of young people are watching. The Federal Trade Commission also needs to do something about these social media influencers who are basically promoting gambling under the guise of entertainment.
We also have to remember that the gambling industry, they have a vested interest in influencing the debate around regulation.
Oh, absolutely. Like a lot of industries that profit from potentially harmful products, the gambling industry is very strategic. They try to sway research, policy decisions, and public opinion to protect their bottom line. We need to be aware of these tactics.
So if we're talking about research into gambling disorder and developing effective treatments, who should be footing the bill for that?
That's a good question. We need to move away from relying so heavily on the gambling industry to fund research and treatment programs. We need more independent funding from government agencies or charitable foundations to avoid conflicts of interest and make sure that public health is the top priority, not profit. We also need to remember the precautionary principle. If there's a reasonable suspicion that something is harmful, we need to take action to prevent harm, even if we don't have absolute proof. And the burden of proof should be on the people who are profiting from potentially harmful activities like commercial gambling.
What about specific regulatory measures? What would make the biggest difference in protecting people?
We need mandatory measures that actually limit how much people can gamble. This means setting and enforcing deposit limits, limits on how much people can bet, tailoring those limits to individuals. We also need universal pre-commitment systems. Pre-commitment lets people set limits on their spending and time before they even start gambling, which is a really important safeguard. It's interesting, jurisdictions that have specifically said we're changing our gambling policies to protect public health, they've been more likely to adopt these kinds of preventative measures. Just relying on the gambling industry to regulate itself, that's not going to work. Their main goal is profit, which clashes with harm reduction. So governments have to step up and put public health first. And this isn't just a local issue, it's a global one. We need urgent, coordinated action at the international level to tackle the harms of gambling.
Wow, we covered a lot of ground today. This was an incredibly insightful deep dive into gambling disorder. We talked about how common it is in different groups, the alarming trends we're seeing in young people, the huge impact of technology, the science behind addiction, the best ways to diagnose and treat it, how parents can help, and what kinds of regulations we need to make things safer.
Yeah, I hope this discussion gave everyone listening a much clearer understanding of this issue and why it's so important.
So one last thing for everyone to think about. We've seen how addictive gambling can be. The brain science makes that very clear. And we've talked about how much advertising we're all exposed to. So thinking about all of that, what are our responsibilities as individuals, as tech companies that provide these platforms, and as governments to create an environment that reduces harm while still respecting people's freedom of choice? It's a complicated ethical question as gambling becomes more accessible and the marketing becomes more sophisticated. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
I am Dr. O'Leary, and this has been an episode of Side Actic.